The crack echoed through the darkness like a gunshot. Robert Hutchins jerked awake, listening. Another crack, sharp and metallic, coming from the direction of the barn. He knew that sound, ice expanding inside metal pipes. He was out of bed before Mary could ask what was wrong. Pulling on pants and boots in the frigid kitchen, the thermometer outside the window read 8 below zero. January 1947 was proving to be the coldest winter Iowa had seen in a decade, and according to the radio weatherman, a massive cold front was pushing down from Canada. Temperatures could drop to 20 below by week's end. Robert grabbed the kerosene lantern and headed across the yard. The snow squeaked under his boots, that distinctive sound snow only makes when it's bitter cold. The crystals so frozen they can't compress properly. His breath froze into white clouds that hung in the still air. The barn was warmer than outside, heated by 30 head of cattle, but when Robert reached the stock tank, his stomach dropped. Ice covered the surface, already an inch thick. He grabbed the pipe from the windmill and tapped it with his knuckle. Solid. The entire line had frozen overnight. This wasn't just inconvenient. This was dangerous. Cattle could survive days without food if they had to, but water was different. A cow needed 8 to 12 gallons a day in winter, more in summer. Go 24 hours without water and milk production crashed. 48 hours and you started seeing health problems, weakness, kidney stress, digestive shutdown. 72 hours and animals started dying. Robert had 30 cows depending on him. He needed water flowing again, and he needed it soon. He ran back to the house. Mary was already stoking the wood stove, moving with the practiced efficiency of a farm wife who'd woken to emergencies before. "The whole line's frozen," Robert said, reaching for the telephone on the wall. Mary lifted the receiver and waited. Their party line connected 5 farms, and someone was already talking, Emma Peterson's voice discussing a church committee meeting. Mary waited 30 seconds, then clicked the hook twice to signal she needed the line. Emma kept talking. "Emma," Mary said firmly into the mouthpiece, "we have an emergency. I need the line." Emma disconnected. Mary asked the operator for Tom Henderson's farm. Tom answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the 4:30 a.m. hour. Robert explained the situation. "Don't try heating those pipes with a torch," Tom said immediately. "You'll split them wide open. I'm coming over. Get your cattle some water any way you can until I get there." Robert hauled water for the next hour. 10-gallon milk cans from the kitchen pump, carried one at a time across the yard to fill buckets in the barn. Mary kept the kitchen stove going hot, warming water just enough that it wouldn't freeze instantly when poured into buckets in the below-zero barn. The work was backbreaking. Each trip took 5 minutes. Pump the can full, carry it to the barn, pour it into buckets, distribute buckets to the cattle, return for more. The cattle drank gratefully, their hot breath creating clouds of steam around the buckets. Robert could see the desperation in how quickly they emptied each bucket. They'd been thirsty for hours. Tom's truck crunched into the yard, just as weak dawn light started turning the eastern sky gray. He'd been farming in Iowa since 1928, 19 years of dealing with broken equipment, brutal weather, and livestock that needed care regardless of conditions. If anyone knew how to fix this, Tom did. He examined the frozen tank without a word, then climbed the windmill tower to check the pump head. The metal rungs were so cold they burned through Robert's gloves when he climbed up behind him. "Here's your first problem," Tom said, pointing to the drop pipe that descended into the well. "When your windmill stops pumping, water sits in this pipe and freezes. Once it freezes, the whole system stops working. So what do I do?" "We install a drain-back valve at the bottom of this pipe, down in the well. When the windmill stops, water drains back into the well where it stays at about 50 degrees year-round. Can't freeze if it's not in the pipe." They climbed back down. Robert's hands were numb, despite heavy gloves. "Can we install it today?" Robert asked. Tom shook his head. "Hardware store doesn't open till 8, but I can tell you what else needs fixing while we're waiting." He pointed to the stock tank. "This needs a heater. There are electric ones in the Sears catalog, about $15. Takes 2 weeks to arrive." 2 weeks? That cold front's coming in 3 days. "I know. So we're going to build you an emergency heating system using what you've got on hand." While they hauled more water for the cattle, the animals would need water again by noon. Tom explained what Robert's grandfather had understood about winter water systems. The old man had used a spring house on his farm, 40 miles north, a small building built directly over a natural spring. Water came out of the ground at 45 to 50 degrees year-round. The building itself, with thick walls and earth banked on 3 sides, kept the interior above freezing even in the worst cold. "You don't have a spring," Tom said, dumping another bucket for an eager cow. "But the principle's the same. The earth stays warm deep down. Your well water is about 50 degrees. If we can protect that warmth, keep it from escaping, we can keep your system from freezing." By 8 a.m. they'd watered all 30 cattle and were driving into town. The hardware store owner, Ed Mitchell, unlocked the door when he saw Tom's truck. "Frozen water line?" Ed asked. He'd been selling supplies to farmers for 20 years. He knew what brought people in before official opening time in January. "Need a drain-back valve for a windmill drop pipe," Tom said. "And whatever else you'd recommend for a wellhead in this cold." Ed sold them the valve, 50 feet of insulating wrap for exposed pipes, and a small kerosene lantern. "For your well house," he explained to Robert, "if you've got one." "I don't." "Then you're building one today," Tom said, "before that cold front hits." They spent the morning installing the drain-back valve. The work required climbing the windmill tower repeatedly in 8-degree cold, lowering tools and parts down into the well, working by feel more than sight in the narrow confines of the well casing. Robert's fingers went numb 3 times, requiring breaks in the barn to warm them against a cow's flank. But by noon they had it working. Tom spun the windmill blades by hand. There was no wind, and they watched water pump up through the pipe and flow into the stock tank. Then Tom stopped the blades and they listened. A hollow, gurgling sound came from deep in the well as water drained back down. "That's what you want to hear," Tom said. "Every time the wind stops, that water goes back where it's warm. Pipe stays empty, nothing to freeze." They ate lunch in Mary's kitchen, bean soup and cornbread. While they ate, Tom sketched a simple well house design on the back of an envelope. "Double walls," he said, drawing 2 parallel lines. "Fill the gap with sawdust. Acts as insulation. Keep a small lantern burning inside for heat. The combination will keep your well head above freezing even at 20 below. Where do I get sawdust?" "Lumber mill, they give it away. They've got piles of it they don't know what to do with." That afternoon, Robert drove to the mill and filled the bed of his truck with sawdust. Then he spent the rest of the daylight hours building a small structure over his wellhead, using lumber from his barn. Double walls, 3 feet by 3 feet, just tall enough to stand in. He packed sawdust between the inner and outer walls, working quickly because the radio was calling for the cold front to arrive by tomorrow evening. Mary brought him coffee at 4 p.m. "Temperature's already dropping," she said. "Radio says 10 below tonight, 15 below tomorrow night, then the real cold hits." Robert worked until he couldn't see anymore, then set the kerosene lantern inside the new well house and lit it. The small flame didn't look like much, but when he closed the door and checked back 15 minutes later, he could feel the difference. Outside temperature was 12 below. Inside the well house it was only 2 below, 10 degrees warmer, but the well house only protected the well head. Water still had to travel from there to the stock tank through 100 yards of buried pipe. That pipe ran 3 feet deep, which Tom had said wasn't enough for a winter this cold. "Frost line can go down 4, even 5 feet in a hard freeze," Tom had explained. 3 feet is fine most years, but not this year. The next morning brought crystalline cold that made the inside of Robert's nose freeze with each breath. 11 below zero at dawn. The new well house had worked, nothing frozen there. The drain-back valve had worked, no ice in the drop pipe. But the main line to the stock tank was frozen solid again. Robert was hauling water when Carl Morrison drove into the yard. Carl was in his 60s, had been farming since the Dakota Territory, days before statehood. Tom had called him last night, asked if he'd come by and show Robert some old-timer tricks for keeping water flowing in serious cold. Carl looked at the frozen pipe and nodded slowly. "Had the same problem my second winter farming. Ground froze so deep that year, 4-foot burial wasn't enough. Had to learn fast or lose cattle." He walked Robert around the barn to where manure was piled. "This is your temporary insulation," Carl said. "Fresh manure generates heat as it decomposes. Not much, but some. And the pile itself blocks wind and holds warmth from the ground." They spent 2 hours piling fresh manure around the exposed sections of pipe near the stock tank and at the point where the line came up from underground. The pile steamed slightly in the bitter air, the decomposition process creating visible heat even in 11 below cold. "Won't stop a hard freeze," Carl admitted, "but it'll give you an extra 10, 15 degrees of protection. Might be the difference between flowing water and ice." Carl showed Robert his own stock tank setup back at his farm. A simple but effective system, a firebox about 20 feet from the tank, connected to an old car radiator with pipes. Water circulated from the tank through the radiator where fire heated it, then flowed back to the tank. Gravity and convection did all the work. "Keep a small fire going and that tank won't freeze even at 20 below, Carl said. "I tend mine twice a day, morning and evening. Uses maybe 3 pieces of wood each time." They built Robert a similar system that afternoon, working fast because the sky was turning that peculiar flat white color that meant serious cold was coming. They used an old radiator from a truck Robert had scrapped 2 years ago, some pipe from his barn, and bricks for a simple firebox. By 4 p.m., they had it assembled and water circulating. Robert started a small fire in the box. Within an hour, he could feel warmer water flowing back into the tank. It wasn't hot, just 10 or 15 degrees warmer than the icy well water, but it was enough to keep ice from forming. That night, the big cold front arrived. Robert woke at 2 a.m. when the wind hit the house, rattling windows and howling around the eaves. He checked the thermometer, 18 below zero and dropping. He dressed in every layer he owned and went to check the barn. The cattle were fine, huddled together for warmth. The stock tank had a skim of ice forming around the edges, but the fire-heated system was keeping the center liquid. Robert added wood to the firebox, then checked his other systems. The well house was holding at 6 degrees, still freezing, but 12 degrees warmer than outside. The lantern was burning low. He refilled it, adjusted the wick slightly higher. The drainback valve in the windmill was doing its job, no ice in the drop pipe. But when he checked the main buried line by listening at an access point, he heard nothing. No flow. The line had frozen again despite the manure banking. Robert stared at that silent pipe and felt the weight of the cold, of the cattle depending on him, of systems failing faster than he could fix them. 20 below zero with a strong wind made the effective temperature much colder. He'd been farming for 12 years, and this moment felt like the first time he truly understood how thin the margin was between success and disaster. He hauled water until dawn. Mary helped, both of them moving like automatons through the bitter dark. Pump, carry, pour, repeat. The cattle drank eagerly every time. Robert lost feeling in his toes, despite wool socks and rubber boots. His face hurt from the cold, his lungs aching with each breath of air that felt solid enough to touch. When weak light finally came, Tom's truck pulled into the yard again. Behind him came Carl Morrison and another man Robert didn't know. "This is Jake Morrison," Carl said, introducing a younger man, maybe 40 years old. "He's got a spring system that runs all winter without freezing. Thought he might have ideas." They examined Robert's setup while the wind drove ice crystals against their faces. "The problem," Jake said, "studying the frozen main line, is you're trying to keep still water from freezing. Can't be done in cold like this. Water needs to move." He explained his own system, a natural spring on his property that fed stock tanks through pipes buried 4 feet deep. But the key wasn't just burial depth, it was constant flow. "My spring runs about 2 gallons a minute, 24 hours a day, year-round," Jake said. "Water comes out of the ground at 48 degrees. If it keeps moving, it won't freeze. I've got overflow drains on my tanks, so they don't flood. The excess water drains to a field downhill. Water's always moving, always fresh, never stops." "But I don't have a spring," Robert said. "My windmill only pumps when there's wind." "Right now there's plenty of wind," Tom pointed out. The windmill blades were spinning fast in the gale. "So let's use it." They modified Robert's stock tank to include an overflow drain similar to Jake's system. Now, when the windmill pumped, which it would as long as this wind blew, fresh water flowed continuously into the tank and excess drained away. The constant movement would make the water harder to freeze. But they still had the problem of the main line being frozen. They couldn't wait for it to thaw naturally. That could take days. Only one way to thaw a frozen line fast, Carl said. We pump hot water through it. They set up a system using Mary's kitchen. She heated water on the wood stove, while the men worked outside connecting hoses. When the water was hot, not boiling, just hot enough, they pumped it into the frozen line using a hand pump. It took 3 hours of continuous work, the men taking turns pumping while Mary kept water heating. The wind howled around them, driving the temperature down to 22 below. Finally, around noon, they heard it. A gurgling rush as water broke through the ice blockage and started flowing freely again. The men cheered, their voices whipped away by the wind. The combination of systems started working together. The windmill pumped continuously in the strong wind, sending fresh water through the now thawed main line. The fire-heated radiator system kept the stock tank from freezing. The overflow drain kept water moving. The manure banking provided extra insulation. The well house protected the well head. The drainback valve ensured the drop pipe stayed clear. For 2 days, while the temperature stayed between 18 and 24 below zero, Robert tended his systems like a man keeping multiple plates spinning. He checked the fire every 6 hours, adding wood. He refilled the lantern in the well house twice a day. He monitored the overflow drain to ensure it wasn't freezing. He climbed the windmill tower once daily to verify the drainback valve was working. The cattle drank whenever they wanted. The water flowed. The systems held. On the 3rd day, the temperature rose to 10 below. On the 4th day, 0. The worst had passed, but Robert knew he wasn't done. The electric tank heater he'd ordered still hadn't arrived, and Carl warned him that relying on the fire system alone was risky. What happens when you're sick? Carl asked. Or when you need to go to town? Fire goes out, tank freezes. You need a backup that doesn't require constant tending. The electric heater arrived on a Tuesday 2 weeks after Robert ordered it. He installed it immediately, dropping the heating element into the stock tank and running the cord to the barn's electrical outlet. The unit drew about 1,500 watts and was designed to keep water near it from freezing. The cattle's drinking would help circulate the warmed water throughout the tank. Robert tested it that night. The heater glowed faintly underwater. Within an hour, he could see the difference. No ice forming anywhere near the unit, and the circulation kept the entire tank liquid, even though the outside temperature was still 5 below. He kept the fire system as backup, but let that fire go out. The electric heater handled the job alone. For a week, everything worked perfectly. The windmill pumped when wind blew. The drainback valve kept the drop pipe clear. The manure banking protected the buried line. The electric heater kept the tank liquid. Robert started to relax, started to believe he'd solved the problem. Then the ice storm hit. It came on a Thursday night in early February, freezing rain that coated everything in ice. Robert woke to the sound of tree branches cracking under the weight. The power was out. He knew it immediately. The electric clock in the kitchen was dark, the refrigerator silent. He grabbed his lantern and headed for the barn, moving carefully on ice-coated ground. The stock tank had ice forming already, just 2 hours after the heater lost power. The fire system was cold. He'd been depending on the electric heater and hadn't maintained the firebox. Robert worked in the dark, in freezing rain that coated his coat and hat with ice, rebuilding the fire in the firebox. His hands shook from cold and frustration as he tried to light kindling that kept getting wet. It took 20 minutes to get a fire going, another hour before the water circulating through the radiator was warm enough to make a difference. The ice storm lasted 36 hours. Power stayed out the entire time. Robert tended that fire like his life depended on it, because his cattle's lives did depend on it. Every 6 hours in freezing rain, and then in bitter cold after the storm passed, he added wood and checked the water flow. The windmill kept pumping. At least there was enough wind for that. The drainback valve kept working. The well house protected the well head. The manure banking held, and the fire system, which Robert had nearly abandoned, kept his stock tank liquid. When power finally came back on Saturday afternoon, Robert stood in his barn watching the electric heater glow underwater and understanding something important. Carl had been right about backups. You never relied on a single system when livestock depended on you. The electric heater was convenient, but it was the fire system that had saved him when convenience failed. He kept both systems running after that. The electric heater handled normal operation, But twice a day he added wood to the firebox, keeping a small fire going just in case. The extra work was worth the insurance. A week after the ice storm, they had 3 days of dead calm, no wind at all. The windmill sat motionless, no water pumped. The stock tank level dropped as 30 cattle drank throughout each day. This was when Robert learned the value of Carl's other lesson: emergency reserves. He'd been keeping those large galvanized tubs in the barn filled, and the barn's temperature stayed above freezing thanks to the cattle's body heat. When the windmill couldn't pump, Robert hauled water from those reserves to top off the stock tank. The wind came back on the 4th day. The windmill pumped. Robert refilled his barn reserves. The system recovered. By the end of February, temperatures were finally moderating. The worst of winter had passed. Robert had kept his cattle watered through cold that had tested every system he'd built. But more importantly, he'd learned how winter water systems actually worked. Not from a book or a catalogue, but from Tom and Carl and Jake and his own failures and successes. He'd learned that multiple systems backing each other up beat any single solution. He'd learned that moving water was harder to freeze than still water. He'd learned that Earth stayed warm deep down even when the surface was frozen solid. He'd learned that some techniques, like sawdust insulation and fire heating, came from homesteaders 50 years ago because they worked then and they work now. When March brought the first real thaw, Robert spent 2 weeks digging up his main water line and reburying it at 5 feet deep. He wrapped vulnerable sections with burlap and tar paper. He installed additional drainback valves at key points. He built permanent insulated housings around pipe sections that came near the surface. Next winter, when the cold came again, his systems ran without failure. The year after that, when newcomers bought the farm to his south, Robert spent an afternoon showing them what he'd learned. The knowledge passed from neighbor to neighbor, the same way it had been passed to him. Thank you for watching this video. If you learned something about how American farmers kept livestock watered through brutal winters, please hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share this with anyone interested in farming history and rural American heritage. This video is inspired by true historical facts and the real experiences of American farmers during the 1930s through 1970s. It is not intended to represent or offend any individual. Robert Hutchins is a representative character who reflects the actual experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar water system challenges during this era. Their knowledge, ingenuity, and willingness to help neighbors created the resilient farming communities that fed America through some of its most challenging years.